This is Beyond 21st Century Skills. I want to talk a little bit about education and what when we talk about education, we talk about sort of what has been the crux of education throughout many centuries, right? If we're to look at the names of classes as they're listed in our class lists and our course registers, we see that mostly, and maybe rightly so, there's been an emphasis on content. That has really been the driver for much of education, is content. And don't get me wrong, content is absolutely important. But really, we're in an age when content itself, if the answer to a question is something that can be looked up via a quick search on the internet, we haven't really gone far enough. And I don't think this is something that many educators disagree with. As I've met, most educators understand the importance of content and helping people to gain a knowledge for themselves, but they also understand going beyond that content. To better understand what skills people are looking for in this 21st century, some of my colleagues and I, we went out and we looked at the literature and we looked to see what are the types of things that people are looking for when they look to hire new employees. This is from some of the literature, a breakdown of the top skills that employers have said that they're looking for. And if we look at it, we can see how they group together in four main areas in the middle: interpersonal skills, job-specific skills, personal qualities, and cognitive ability. If I were to break those down, I would say that two of those, job-specific skills and cognitive ability, absolutely deal with content. So content knowledge is still important. But I can also see that interpersonal skills and personal qualities make up the other half of those. In fact, I ask myself, as a professor, as an instructor, how often I am helping to cultivate these types of skills in my students. To understand that a little bit better, one of my colleagues and I, Dr. Jason McDonald, we surveyed local businesses to find out, local employers, to find out within our field of instructional design, what are the skills that employers are looking for. As we did so, and we look at the research as well on this, we see that the top 10 skills that people are looking for go far beyond content. The top skill, when we asked employers what they're looking for, is the ability to collaborate, to work in a team. They also talk about the importance of responsibility. They're looking for people who can plan and organize, who can reason analytically. Clearly, in the middle here, we have the job-specific know-how and computer skills that are specific to the content that they're looking at. But again, that goes beyond. They're looking for people who can work with challenge. They're looking for people who are creative, who don't stop learning, who don't come to the job thinking that they've arrived, but rather that they've begun. And of course, the ability to communicate verbally. This isn't a new idea. This is something, I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the Partnership for 21st Century Learning. The Partnership for 21st Century Learning talks about needing to go beyond content and moving into skills and cultivating skills in students that will help them to succeed in a 21st century economy. If we look at those are communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. So I want to briefly talk about those. What are these and what do they mean? So you can go to the Partnership for 21st Century Learning's website after this, and they'll go into each of these in depth. But really briefly, by communication, we're talking about the ability to talk with others around a specific topic, especially those who have different views than your own. It's really important to be able to work in a team with those who have different ideas and bring different ideas. Research has shown time and again that it's the diversity of ideas that typically leads to better solutions, which actually brings us to this idea of collaboration. It's not just diversity of ideas and ways of expressing yourself, but it's actually the diversity of skills. The majority of people don't work in jobs today that require only their specific specialty, their specific skill. It's important that people learn how to collaborate as they work on these different projects, especially as they work on problems that may not have one specific answer. That's the type of thing that we're talking about when we talk about 21st century learning. We're talking about going beyond declarative knowledge and answers to questions that are well known. Rather, we want to engage students in answers to problems and trying to solve problems that may not have one solution or that may not require one skill set. And in this case, we talk about the importance of collaboration, right? As students come together, it's important for them to be able to bring different skills to the table. Critical thinking. When we talk about critical thinking, what do we mean? This pyramid, or rather it's a taxonomy that I represented here off to the right. Benjamin Bloom was an educational researcher, and he and his colleagues in the 1950s began studying teaching, and they began studying the way that teachers asked questions and the types of activities they engaged students in. As they did so, after an 8-year study, they came to develop what they called the cognitive taxonomy of learning. And in this cognitive taxonomy, at the lower levels, we're asking students to do things that ask them to remember and understand. Even applying is following a set of steps or knowing which steps to apply in a situation. When we talk about critical thinking, we're referring more often to these higher order skills, the ability to analyze, evaluate, and create, or synthesize, bring together new ideas. It's important to be able to think critically in order to solve these ideas that I was talking about that are ill-structured ideas without a single solution to the problem. Creativity is an interesting aspect to this as well. Creativity and critical thinking go hand in hand. And while that might seem counterintuitive at some points, let me explain through personal experience what I mean by this and why creativity is important. So I've always liked to draw, and I discovered when I met my wife, who at the time was an interest, that she liked to draw as well. And so one day we went out to a local park with our drawing pads, and we sat down and we started drawing. And she challenged me to draw a hand holding a stick. It's not this hand, but I drew a hand holding a stick, and really proudly I handed it back to her. And and she looked at it and she said, "Well, that's a good hand, but that's not this hand." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you can't just look at something once and then draw it, right? You need to look at it, and you need to look at it again, and you need to keep looking at it, and you need to look at it from different angles. You can't just do something once and then think you've arrived." This opened my eyes. After that moment, I started to look at everything differently. I started to look at bushes and ugly trees and things that were amorphous, shadows on the ground. And I tried to draw these things, and I kept looking at them. Learning to look is important when we talk about creativity. Creativity is looking again. It's opening your eyes to see things again and to look at them from a different perspective. Creativity gives flavor to critical thinking. So when we talk about the 4 C's of 21st century education, we're really referring to the importance of collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. And as I just revealed, it's also important, I'd like to add a 5th C, which is being increasingly added. This is this idea of computing. So computing is quickly becoming required all over the world. Now, from a recent report, we see this idea of coding at school. And actually, this infographic is even a few years old at this point. Digital skills and competencies are going to be increasingly important in tomorrow's world, both economically and cognitively. We can see here by 2020, Europe's expected to see a shortage of more than 800,000 professionals with computing skills. In the United States, we're missing a good 60 to 80% of the workforce that is needed is missing in terms of missing these skills. In fact, during the recent economic downturn about a decade ago, when every other job was bleeding in terms of they were just losing workers because of not having the jobs in the economy. At the same time, the need for computer scientists rose 8%. So coding is really important. In fact, we see from this map from a few years ago, all the different countries in Europe that are have already integrated coding into their school curriculum or have started to. We see this happening at different rates in different countries. In fact, we see it all over the world. Israel has been a country that a decade and a half, almost 2 decades ago, began requiring all of their high school students to study computer science. New Zealand revamped their curriculum. Australia revamped their curriculum. In second grade, kids begin to learn computing. South Korea begins this year, and the U.S. is just beginning. The first state in the U.S., Virginia, just made it a law about 2 months ago that all kids have to learn how to code. So we see the computing happening and taking over in so many places, but computing goes beyond just learning to code. The idea of computational thinking has been widely promoted. What do we mean by computational thinking? Computational thinking is the act of breaking down a problem. It's the way it's been described many different ways, but mostly it's been described as the way that computer scientists will approach and resolve problems using technology. So if we were to look at this, computational thinking is often thought of as breaking down a problem, finding patterns, creating algorithms with those patterns, automating the process, and this is where technology and coding might come in, and analyzing the data. This is where efficiency or debugging solutions might come into play. And so computational thinking has been shown to extend far beyond the needs of just computer scientists. It's a type of thinking and a type of problem solving that has been used and demonstrated to be used in many different professions. So let's give an example of that. This is sort of an example of an activity that we have some kids do through the use of robotics, Lego robotics. And so on the left-hand side, you see a blue square that represents a robot, and their robot has to start anywhere inside of this gray stripe. As the robot begins in the gray stripe, the robot has to pick up the red ball and make its way to the yellow circle at the end where it drops off and delivers that ball. When I first present this task to kids, it's overwhelming. And they say, how are we going to get our robots to do that? So the first part of learning to think computationally is learning to see a big problem and to break it down into smaller problems. So if we were to look at this one, we might say, what are the smaller components of this problem? Getting the robot to move is one of them, right? So is picking up the ball, detecting if there's a wall in front of the robot, and putting the ball down. Once we break that problem into its smaller problems, we can work on the smaller problems and then eventually put those together to solve one large problem, right? We can see students learning to use this ability far beyond computing. This is the type of ability that we want them to be able to use in all sorts of classrooms. For example, learning how to write a story. Often kids will just charge right into writing a story. Or they'll freeze up not knowing where to start. Both of those approaches are approaches that I've seen as I've worked with kids in the classroom, and both of those approaches often don't result in solving the problem of needing to write a story. Rather, if we can help kids take a step back and say, well, what are the parts to your story, right? What is the context? What is the setting of the story? What is the problem of the story? Who are the players in the story? And so learning to break down a problem is part of computational thinking that helps them to solve these problems. When they break down a problem, often within those, they help to find patterns. With those patterns, then they can create algorithms. So for example, an algorithm that might be used in solving one of those smaller problems that kids have used, and this was use an ultrasonic sensor to see if there's something so many centimeters in front of me. If there is, turn right 90 degrees and then advance 40 centimeters and repeat this 3 times. This helps them to work on the problem of getting the robot to move through the maze. I'm going to pause there for a minute. I'm worried that whether or not I'm actually having this presenting is working. Okay, hopefully it is. It looks like it is right now. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to presenting on the screen. It's full screen, so it's hard for me to see everything that's going on. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead, and in the upper left-hand corner, if you hover over your video, you should be able to see an icon for the chat window. If you click on that, you should be able to put any questions or comments that you have in the group chat. So back to this. Creating algorithms, we've talked about this a little bit, right? Algorithms is this idea of a set of instructions that can be followed, and given any specific input can have a predictable outcome. It's a sort of a simple description of what an algorithm might be. We have so many ways of building understanding through computational thinking now. I've seen teachers teach simple machines. I've seen teachers work with problem-solving apps, which are now, there's so many out there. A couple examples, CargoBot or Tinderbox that I've seen my kids work with. Robots. Lots of teachers are now using robots to help kids learn how to think computationally to solve these open-ended problems using computing and analytical thinking and reasoning. Code.org is a site that has become widely popular to help kids begin to learn the basics and the fundamentals of computing. The International Society of Technology and Education has computational thinking materials that are freely available to all to help teachers learn how to teach and to promote computational thinking. The programming of games is another way that I've seen teachers use computational thinking with others and to cultivate that in students. And the Society for Computing and Education as well, for teachers of computing, their computational thinking standards that they've put out. I see that in the UK where there are computational thinking standards that have been developed, and in Finland and in Australia, and now the K12CS.org in the United States has also created these standards for helping teachers understand what computational thinking is and how to promote it in students. In fact, probably one of the most encouraging bits of teaching students computational thinking goes far beyond this idea of just computing itself, as I've noticed. So a little bit ago, about a year and a half ago, we conducted a survey that we sent out to teachers on computing lists, such as computing at school and other lists. We got teachers from 23 different countries. We got responses from teachers in 23 different countries. A couple hundred responses. A lot of those came from here in the UK, about 100 different responses. And we asked lots of questions. One of the questions we asked as an open-ended question was, what change, if any, have you noticed in your students since you've begun to teach computing? There were lots of different answers, but one answer that popped up a lot had to do with this idea of getting an answer wrong. So often when I work in schools and I watch students fail, and I watch students struggle when they fail, and students begin to interpret failure as a message about their ability in certain aspects or their potential. And even though teachers themselves are not telling students to give up, and teachers tell them to push through failure, to try again, one of the things I've noticed is that students get the idea that failure really is a summative evaluation. Well, in computing, we see something incredible as we ask these teachers what changes they've noticed. They talked about students beginning to become more resilient and using failure as a formative feedback tool rather than as a summative evaluation. So for example, these are some of the quotes from different teachers when we just asked this open-ended question of what changes have they noticed. Students are more confident. They're less worried about getting it wrong. They have better skills to figure out problems, so they don't mind if they don't get it right the first time. There's an increased willingness to try things multiple times if they don't succeed the first time. Students have a better ability to break down a problem into smaller pieces rather than looking at something as a whole. They're not easily discouraged. Persistence at problem solving is increased. I noticed that it's taught kids that failure is okay, not to give up and keep trying, even when things get challenging. Greater resilience and confidence, more focused on how to solve a problem rather than doing it right. Less quick to give up, more interested in problems, more logical thinkers. As a teacher, if I were to see that this was the result of some type of intervention, a new way of teaching something, I would be interested in it regardless of what it was, because this is probably one of the most important things. As we see by recent books that have been based on years of research, such as Mindset, that talk about the importance of learning to push through failure. This is one way of perhaps teaching students to push through failure. In itself, it is not an end unto itself, but it is a very fortunate effect that we're starting to see with those who push through and learn the challenging aspects of learning computing, right? And it's not all easy, and that's okay. So we talked about these 5 C's of a 21st century education: creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and I would add computing. I want to ask a question. Are these sufficient? Is it enough to promote these 5 things? Let me give a couple of examples where I see these 5 different skills or characteristics in play. Speaking of play, games. Games is a great way to see these five abilities put to the test, especially massively multiplayer online games. My wife and I actually used to rent our basement to a student from China. Very smart young man, and he played these online games often late into the night or early into the morning, as it were. And he learned and improved his English by talking with people in these games where they had to collaborate to solve problems. And they used critical thinking to outwit not just the programmed game, but other teams. They used computing to cheat the game in different ways. And they were certainly creative in their solutions. But I would ask, is this really what we're aiming for when we talk about these 5 C's and 21st century learning? Is battling imaginary creatures the way that we are trying to really foster more critical thinkers? I imagine most people would recognize who this is. This is Adolf Hitler. I have an interesting family story here with Adolf Hitler. My grandfather was a missionary in Germany in 1930 to 1933. While he was there, he had the opportunity to observe a man speaking at a park one day. There was a large crowd of people gathered. He stopped by, he wrote in his journal about this experience, and he saw Adolf Hitler speak, and he mentioned how powerful of a speaker he was and how scared he was because of how good of a communicator this man was, because the things he was communicating were atrocious. And he was worried about what was going to happen. And I believe he had a right to be worried. He was able to see the transfer of power over his next few years there and watched a lot of things happen. Hitler truly was more than just a great communicator. He was a great collaborator. He was a very critical thinker. He was creative in his solutions. And believe it or not, he used computing. The Enigma machine was a machine that was used to encode the messages that the Nazis would send to each other and to recode the code every day. This became a huge turning point in the war, both for the Nazi Party as well as for the Allied forces once they were able to finally create their own computing machine that would combat the computing that the Nazis had employed. In fact, another machine was the precursor to the modern calculator. It was used to tally the number of, to keep tally of the number of Jews that had been massacred or captured. So we see how computing and creativity and collaboration and communication can be used for nefarious means. This is a big sum of money, $450 billion. Any guess what industry earned $450 billion in 2016? That's just over 326 billion British pounds. That industry was cybercrime. It's projected that cyber criminals stole more than $450 billion worth of money online in 2016. There is an entire marketplace on the dark web. In fact, there are dozens of marketplaces, many of which were just taken down a few weeks ago. And because they operate in the dark, their creators and their managers have to use all sorts of critical thinking and creativity to outwit those who would take them down. They have to use communication amongst each other. Like I said, there's an entire marketplace and the way that they talk with each other and figure out how to communicate is truly collaborative and creative. And they do all of this through the means of computing. So I've talked about how important it is to cultivate these 5 C's of a 21st century learning. And then we look at all of these awful things that can happen when people employ these 5 C's in nefarious ways. So what's missing? I would contend that without compassion, we're in for a rough ride. That compassion is the lens through which we need to teach all of these 5 C's. Let me give some examples of where we have seen compassion come into play. Fold It. I'm not sure who's ever heard of Fold It, but Fold It was a game created by some biochemists who were struggling with the folding of proteins. Well, they decided to make that to make a game out of their problems that they were having and to make the game collaborative, where groups of diverse people could form a team online and try to fold proteins. And so you had people who weren't biochemists, people who had no background in folding proteins, come together and create better models of folding proteins that have led to scientific and medical breakthroughs. This is using the 5 C's together with compassion to solve a problem, to say, how can we make it better? How can we use collaboration to make things better? Codeando Mexico is another example. In Mexico, the Mexican government was going to give $9.2 million to a local company over 2 years for this company to create an app that would help legislators track the bills that were proposed. For those who can program, you're probably thinking, wow, 9.2 million for an app that basically is pretty easy to make. That sounds great. Mexican citizens who got wind of this contract deal were very upset. And they said, wait a sec, that's a simple app. Why is the government going to spend so much on a simple app? And why is it going to be limited just to legislators? Tell you what, we're going to have our own contest. We're going to have our contest to create the very app that the government is asking for. And instead of 2 years, we're going to give people 10 days to try and create this app. And instead of $9.3 million, we're going to award the winners of this app $9,300, 10,000 times less. In the 10 days that the contest was open, they received 173 different proposals for applications. They chose 5 of those and made those freely available to the Mexican populace. That's using compassion together with the 5 C's. Um, Jeff Kirshner is a developer who lives in Silicon Valley area of the United States. He was out walking in the beautiful forests um, by his uh, uh, um, by his home, and in with he was out walking with his kids, and they found something on the ground. They found this, and the kids said, "Dad, why would somebody throw a cigarette butt on the ground in this beautiful forest?" In this area. He said, I don't know, but you know what? Let's do something about it. Let's take a picture of the trash and we'll pick it up and we'll tell people we picked up a piece of trash in this area and here's what we picked up. That turned into an idea for an app. He said, well, why can't other people do that? They started sharing this idea with others and posting pictures of the trash they picked up and where they picked it up. And soon his kids' friends started using the app. And they made it freely available, and the app tags, geotags where the trash is picked up. And you can see from this map, all the trash that was picked up around the kids' school. That empty spot in the middle of all of these geotags is the kids' school. Well, he began to wonder, what is the trash that's most picked up around the kids' school? And you know what he found? This. It was a straw. In fact, the majority of the straws were still packaged. They went to the school and they asked the school, do you know why there are so many straws being picked up around the school? And the school said, well, we give out straws at lunch with every meal. Apparently, the kids are taking the straws and they're not using them. So instead of giving them out by default, the school stopped giving out straws only by default, only upon request, and the school is saving money, and it's now a cleaner society, right? That's using compassion together with the 5 C's. Or how about Kenneth Shizuoka? Kenneth is a young man who lived with his grandfather. And one day when he was about 9 or 10 years old, he was went on a walk with his grandfather. And they were in a park, and his grandfather forgot who he was. He forgot who Kenneth was. He had early onset Alzheimer's. After that, he began to go downhill. His health began to go downhill, and it was really tiring for Kenneth's family to take care of their grandfather because he would get up and wander around at night. So somebody always had to be attentive to pay attention to what would happen because the grandfather would wander. One day, Kenneth used his creativity to look again, and he noticed something that he hadn't noticed before. He noticed that his grandfather always wore socks to bed. So Kenneth started using his computational thinking to solve this problem and said, what if I create an app that a sock that has a sensor in the sock, and the sensor, when it's stepped on, sends a signal to my phone, and then my phone will tell me if grandpa is up and walking around. So that's exactly what Kenneth did. In the end, it ends up being a rather simple but innovative solution to this problem. And he created a company, Safe Wander, that now enables families to be able to track their grandparents or others that might need that as they walk around. Right? That's using compassion. Consider this young man. I have a colleague, Jeff Wright, who runs an innovation competition every year at the university. Last year, at our university, last year he decided to run this competition with public school students in primary and secondary education. This is one of his favorite inventions that came out of this competition this past year. He's a young man who was visiting his grandparents and his grandmother at an old folks home. And he saw another lady up there walking with a stick. And he asked his mother, why is she walking with a stick? And his mother said, she's blind. Have you never seen that? And he's like, I've never seen that. I've never seen somebody walk with a stick like that. And so he talked to the lady and said, does that help you not run into things? And she said, yes, I still run into things about 10 times a day, but in general, it helps. So he started to think, well, how can I help people who are blind run into things less? And he came up with the idea of putting a sensor in a hat. And as you get close to something, the sensor would beep. And if you get closer, it would be faster. And a really simple solution. And he showed us his code. It was less than 50 lines of code to create this program. And he prototyped it with the blind people at his grandmother's old folks home. And after prototyping it, he asked them, do you still bump into things? They said, yes, but only about 5 times a day now. Thank you. That was using his compassion with his 5 C's. I'm sure people have heard of some of the things that the funtheory.com has done. Fun Theory is a division of, or an initiative by Volkswagen that tries to use fun to change human behavior. For example, the world's deepest trash bin is a trash bin where when you throw trash away, it makes a sound like just doing something as simple as that encouraged people to start picking up trash in their local areas and throw it away in the trash bin. Another example from the Fun Theory is the speed camera lottery, where they're trying to show people, instead of punishing them for exceeding the speed limit, rewarding people and showing them how they're driving under the speed limit, right? The idea of the play belt. The play belt is a simple solution to getting kids to buckle up in the car. The in-car entertainment only works once someone is actually buckled in. Or this idea where people can recycle metals and papers and plastics, but they don't recycle glass so much, which is interesting because glass is so fully recyclable. Well, they decided to make an arcade game out of it, right? So this idea of they're turning glass recycling into an arcade game, where a local our glass recycling center that was a few blocks over from this received about two bottles in the same amount of time that this arcade received 100 different bottles, right? We can use our compassion to look at problems and solve those problems using the 5 C's of 21st century learning in creative and fun ways. An example that I love, and the videos I've put off to the side on cards, which you can look at afterwards. It's hard to show videos as I do this presentation as well. Comes from Enchroma and Valspar. Valspar is a paint company. Enchroma teamed up with Valspar to address the idea of color blindness. 8% of men in the world are colorblind in some way, and only about 0.5% of women. That's not, on the one hand, it's a lot of people. On the other hand, for a large paint company, it seems like a small percentage of people to work with or to be concerned about. But they decided they were going to work on this problem of colorblindness. It ends up that colorblindness is something that can be treated, and they created lenses to help people see colors for the first time. I encourage you to go out and look up the videos on this. I've got a video linked off to the side on this. I tear up every time I watch it. They use their compassion and their knowledge that they had together with computing and critical thinking to come up with a solution to allow people to see something that they'd never seen before. I can't imagine the world without some of the colors in it, but that's how some people experience it, but not anymore because of someone else's compassion. There's so many examples of how we can use creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and computing. There's good examples and there's bad examples. As we strive to teach these things, to cultivate these things in today's youth, so that they're ready for this world that they inherit, let us remember how important it is that they do it using compassion. So I'd like to leave a challenge for all those who are with me. What good will you create? Thank you. I'll go to looking at questions, and hopefully things haven't totally bugged out. So I'd like to go ahead and answer people's questions now. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing that part of the screen, and I'll show these others. So I'm gonna show really quickly how to put a chat on, and the way to do that, if you're interested, this is you see lots of overlays here. If you click on your window, you can see this chat window up here. If you click on that chat window, it either opens or closes. So people can write in here. I'm going to write, what questions do you have? Right? So we can see this is like an infinite mirror here. I'm going to stop doing that before it totally gets the computer going. And I don't know if I finish this maybe 6 minutes ahead of everyone because of that issue I had at the beginning. But I'm going to go ahead and take any questions. So, there's a chat in YouTube. Thank you. I didn't see what was going on, that the chat's going on in YouTube. Great. So I'll go ahead and try to answer some of this right now. And Kate is helping me out here. If I open up, I will go ahead and do that. So the part of the problem with presenting there, and I had other stuff on the side, and this didn't quite work. So let me see. Okay, so I'm having trouble seeing the chat. I'm going to see if I can find this here. Okay, so I can see some chats here. All right. I do see all the questions that people said now. Great. I might as well answer right now as well. I've got my website is peterjrich.com. I've put a post up there where I will try to respond to people's questions. So I do see one question here. Somebody says, how can we teach compassion? I can't imagine outcomes for it. We've been so trained to think about the cognitive domain of outcomes. Sometimes we forget about the fact that Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues actually came up with 3 different domains, taxonomies in different domains. One was the psychomotor domain, and that's more for physical movements. One was the cognitive domain, which is what we think of when we say Bloom's taxonomy. And the last is actually the affective domain. And so if you were to look up affective domain taxonomy and Bloom, you're going to find that he and his colleagues have actually already thought through ways where we might think about how to come up with outcomes that deal more with affective measures. I also want to mention that somebody asked the question here, how can you get a link to all the info, etc.? So I've put a link, I've made the presentation live, and in making presentation live, I've shared the presentation. So again, if you go to peterjrich.com, I've posted a link to the slides, the Google Slides that you can get there as well. Normally, I'll actually show a couple of videos. I was worried about doing this online. Obviously, I didn't manage everything exactly well online with the chat window as well. So if you go there, you'll see a link both to this recording as well to the slides. Supposedly there's some cards that were created as well to some of the different videos of these different things in action. So that's a good question as well, of how we might be able to address this idea of compassion. How do you teach compassion? I would say, just from my own experience in terms of teaching compassion, what's one of the ways that I've seen it taught, part of it just has to do with thinking about how can we make a difference. Even though it's fun, I love doing games. I love doing games and creating games with kids. Kids love games. I think the activities that we choose when we're teaching computing make a difference. So, for example, are we going to choose the activity of making a game, or are we going to choose the activity of making a difference? Right? As simple as that sounds, sometimes there's some really simple things that we can do. I'll take the example of these youth that I shared here, of Kenneth and this young man who won the innovation competition for middle grades education last year. It was a simple solution that they came up with. It doesn't have to be complex. Sometimes when we want to make a difference, we start thinking of it as a big thing. But just like any problem that we approach with, if we approach it with computational thinking, we can break it into its parts and say, well, there's some smaller parts to this, right? And then we can use our creativity to say, look at it again, right? Like my wife did with me when I was drawing, and she said, no, you need to see this again. You can't just look at it once. You can't just look at the problem once. You need to look at it again. And if we do that, sometimes we may see that we've been looking at a solution rather than looking at the problem. And the problem when you look at a solution is you start to characterize the problem in terms of someone else's solution. If we can see the problem for what it is and focus on that issue, an aspect of it, we can then come up with some rather simple solutions. And so I think it's less about measuring compassion as an outcome and more of using compassion as a lens through which we teach the 5 C's. So, for example, when I'm teaching computing again, or we had a discussion yesterday with Judy and some folks here in Scotland about using data and using data to talk about a school and having students use data. Well, they can use data, but we can also say, well, let's use data for a difference. How can we use data to make a difference, right? Sometimes those differences are small. And we're not always going to change the world, right, in some grandiose way. But what we can do can be compassionate. And the types of things that we can do can be useful. So we can look at other people. And if we approach it that way, one of the things that I have been amazed by is children's creativity and compassion. Creativity when it comes to compassion. When we work with kids and having kids say, well, what is a compassionate way of addressing this situation? They'll come up with all sorts of wonderful solutions. And from those, maybe we can work towards finding solutions for simple things and work towards it as a class together. Great. So I'm going to look at some other questions here. So Greg Coburn says, compassion equals personalization and learning. All positive examples had an example close to the person involved. I think that's a great observation. We have the framework, but are we creating opportunity for it to happen? That's a great open-ended question. Are we creating opportunity? Are we helping people see the world around them? So I'm going to give an activity maybe that can help with that. This is an activity that I've used in an applied creativity class. It's a common creativity technique, and it might sound counterintuitive because we might find compassionate solutions by looking at what bothers us, right? So looking at the things that are your pet peeves may be a way of finding possibly compassionate solutions to things. So, for example, when I teach creativity and applied creativity, I'll have students keep a diary for the first 3 weeks of class about things that bother them. So I say, okay, every day I want you to write down one pet peeve that you noticed that day. One thing that bothered you, Maybe that is while you're driving. For me, a pet peeve is people not indicating when they're driving, right? Maybe another pet peeve is, people not putting on their seatbelts, right? Maybe another pet peeve is people leaving trash on the ground. And we see how some people use that pet peeve instead of using it as a way to condemn others, using it as a vehicle for this personalized compassion that we're talking about here. So pet peeves, keeping a list of your pet peeves, and that may be a way to help people start to see potential problems that they can then approach in compassionate ways. I'm going to mention a few things that are in the chats here. Andrew Gardner is mentioned here that Fostering Compassion is a local charity, local to Edinburgh here, that addresses this with children. They explore empathy with animals. That's fantastic. So Mark Davidson asked if there's any examples how schools have built this compassionate and innovative attitude into the culture of classrooms in a sustainable way. Mark, I don't have any examples off the top of my head. This is something that, I'll be honest, I've been promoting this idea of computing for a long time, and that kids should learn how to do computing before it became sort of a thing. I guess it was a thing when I was a young child anyway. So, a good 30 plus years ago, it was a thing. So maybe that's a bit of hyperbole, but I began thinking about it in terms of my own kids and our own economy in the United States and what was important to me. And where am I going with this, right? You asked this idea of these innovative examples. The problem is, as it's now become more popular and more regular to start promoting this idea of computing, we're really just scratching the surface and trying to figure out what it means and how to do it, right? So as we approach this idea of computing, over several days, all in the mornings at home, I'll often jog on a treadmill, and I'll watch TED Talks. And watching these TED Talks, I started seeing different things, right? So for example, this idea of Kenneth Shizuoka, this young man who created the socks Safe Wonder for his grandfather, or this man, Jeff Kirshner, who created the Literati app, or the $450 billion problem of cybercrime. And as I've been doing these things and I've been watching kids and I've been promoting computing, and I said, oh yeah, make a game and do this, all of these things started coming together where I start seeing, well, what are the good aspects of what we've been promoting, and what are really the consequences of what we're promoting, right? We are promoting that people become more collaborative, communicative, critical thinkers, and creative through the use of computing. But what does that really mean? And when I stopped to think about it, this example of the $450 billion cybercrime really got me thinking. And that's where I at the same time, I'd been reading my aunt had put together some of the journals from my grandfather, and she had translated some of the German that he had written in his journals. And I read this account where he had got to hear Hitler speak. And I started considering Hitler did all of these things that we're trying to promote, and other people did all of these things. And so I don't, kind of a long answer, just saying I don't have these examples, because this is really something that over just about this past year, I've started to promote and started to say, go do something good. Don't just teach computing, teach it in a compassionate way, right? Don't just teach collaboration. We teach collaboration in a compassionate way. We teach people to think collaboratively so that they can come up with compassionate solutions, and they can help each other. And by helping each other, we all come out better, right? So Global Compassion Initiative, some of the other questions on here. So there's lots of good questions on here. I'm going to see if there's a few others. Again, several people have asked for a link to that. Again, if you go to peterjrich.com, the most recent post, I put up a post with a link both to this presentation as well as a link to the Google Slides that I used today. So I'm going to also try to answer any questions that if I see a question appear a lot, I'll try to put that into some of the comments that I find that I'll try and post about that online. One of the things I would love to see, answering maybe Mark's earlier question as well, was this idea of examples of compassionate computing in the classroom, right? And now we're getting really illiterate, right? Compassionate computing in the classroom. I would love to, I'll start a post on my website where we can share examples. And I would love to hear examples from your own kids, from your own experiences, where you've seen compassionate computing put in context, right? As someone mentioned earlier, it really is a personal context. So we'll put that up there and we'll start sharing and maybe create this database or this list of examples of compassionate computing. Okay, so Nori has asked, do I feel children should be looking at coding right away? Okay, so I think Judy has just answered that as well. She said, hey, look, my 3 to 5-year-olds are coding. I used to play the program a person game with my kids before kindergarten, or I think that's called nursery here. It's something that I think that they're capable of, right? I've never seen, so the same worldwide study that I discussed when I shared some of the quotes from teachers, the worldwide study there, we asked teachers, right, about whether or not kids should start or if they should start. And their unequivocal answer was just jump in, just start. A lot of teachers are saying they weren't sure how to do it, and they still weren't sure how to do it. And they're not sure how to do it right. And I think a lot of us are still figuring that out. We're not sure how to teach computing, especially to kids. There's hardly anything written about it, but a lot of us are doing it now. But what will happen if we start teaching them? So let's start teaching them. They are capable. As Judy's mentioned here, Fisher-Price's Codapillar is like a B-bot. The Codapillar itself has physical pieces for coding. So it works for kids who are in that sort of concrete operational or even an operational stage where they can take the pieces and physically put the procedures together, the sequence together, and watch the Codapillar run the sequence of code. There's so many toys. In fact, I started, this is linked on my website under one of the older posts. I don't post that often, so you'll see it's like 5 posts down from the one today. There's a post about tools and products for kids, because a lot of people ask me, well, I want to teach my kid code, so what product should I use? And of course, Scratch is the most commonly used, according to the survey that we put out to teachers. But I said, well, I should probably put together a list because everybody keeps asking me this question. So I did, and my list now has almost 250 different products that have been created to help kids learn how to code. And as coding becomes more commonplace, that list is just going to grow. Every time I put a product on the list, I find 3 more that I didn't know about. Or somebody will say, oh, did you know this or did you know that? And it's a growing it's a growing industry at this point. So we're going to see more and more tools for kids to learn how to code. Nori says he loves the Codapillar, but the music drives him bananas. You're not the only one. I have a friend who tried to turn it off, and unfortunately, it's kind of hardwired into the Codapillar. So she actually opened up the Codapillar to unsolder the piece that goes to the speaker. So people have different solutions to coming up with the sound issue. Okay, Kate is sharing that the Scott website has a guide broken down the Scottish curriculum, ideas for plugged software and unplugged activities without computers. That's great. I would mention as well that there's also, obviously lots of unplugged activities in lots of different places. Unplugged Computing.org is a great one. They have a lot of the original activities from the late 1990s, the book that was invented or written then, and they've come up with lots more since then. Great list for resources. There's so many good comments in here. Let me see. So Judy asked an interesting question earlier on in the discussion. She said, which leads to some, so maybe there's a bit of a discussion going on here. Cian said, the Global Health Academy at Edinburgh has a global compassion initiative. Really interesting. I can't share the link, though it's blocked. So Judy says, which leads to some paradoxical situations. Are you being kind to get an external reward or because you want to be kind? This is actually an issue that I've dealt with in the past and thought about it a bit. I would rather somebody be kind even for an external reward than not kind at all. So that question of why are people being kind, sometimes let's just work on them being kind first before we worry about their motive behind being kind. No, motives are important, and I'm not dismissing those completely out of hand. But let's work on people being kind first. It's kind of like saying, well, did you do your homework because you're intrinsically motivated to learn or because you're going to get the grade? Well, either way, they're doing their homework, right? Or they're getting things done. So sometimes it's okay to do things for external rewards. A lot of us do them all the time, right? Sometimes people do their work for the external reward, right? Yes, it would be great if everybody did everything for their intrinsic reasons. But honestly, there's value to understanding how things work externally and how we can externally motivate things as well. So it's an interesting question. So I'm learning more from reading your comments than you're probably getting from mine here. The fuse from CodeSpark is great. No language and a mute button. The fuse is wonderful, and the fuse. And I've had the opportunity to talk with one of the creators of Fuse about his vision as well. And we talked, I think someone had mentioned earlier about it being most solutions being things that were just close to people personally. And that's actually, the Fuse was a solution close to their creators personally as well, where their children, they were developers, and people were wanting their children to learn coding, and they came up with the idea of creating the Fuse as a way of resolving that issue, right? So yeah, again, here for using our personal issues to further the communal good, right? So Judy said she's asking Valerie if it's suitable for EY. I'm not sure what that means. And so Valerie, if you'll give us an answer to that. Ola Oduku says, I feel that there's the potential for coding to become a crossover subject globally, a bit like maths. I would agree with that, Ola. I would agree. I've often been heard to say that computing is a literacy. It can be done in any subject. It's content agnostic. And so we can use it. It's like writing. It's a way of expressing yourself, right? It's one more way of expressing yourself, which is why it's important for teachers to learn how to code or computing, right? Because it's important for teachers to learn it so that then they can tell their students that it's okay to use that as a way of doing their assignments, right? Creating models, maybe in mathematics or science, or creating an interactive report for your social sciences, or for your creating an interactive story, hypermedia type of story for your language and literature classes, or using your art class as a way, using computing as a vehicle for your art and for all of that's involved with that, writing music, creating visual art, creating stories and dance and all of these things. It really is, for me, computing is a literacy, right? Heaven forbid, everybody shouldn't become a programmer, but everybody should learn how to program, in my mind, because it enables so much more, especially in the world that we live in, right? We're becoming more and more surrounded by a community, a computing, and a computational world, right? The more we understand about the world and the more we become masters of computing, the more mastery we have over the world. Whereas if we don't learn it, we become slaves to it. And I think Nori has probably one of the best suggestions probably on this that I've been able to read through yet today. Nori says, if we all do one random act of kindness daily, we may just set the world in the right direction. That's actually a really good thing. In fact, that goes back to 100 years ago, over 100 years ago now, here in England, with the man who started the scouting program, right? What is the Scouts motto? Is do a good turn daily, right? So, yay, Scouts! If we all just do a random act of kindness once a day, right? We might send the world in the right direction, as Nori has mentioned. Judy did bring up a good point in my conversation about external motivations and rewards. They can definitely backfire. We actually had part of this conversation yesterday when you reward something for a while. Let me give an example of that. So imagine that you lived on a street, and this was back in the day when we had tin trash cans on the street, and you're an older fellow, and the kids come running down the street and they bang on your trash cans every week on trash day. And they bang, 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 bang. And you offer the kids money to stop banging on the trash cans. Hey, if you don't bang on my trash cans, I'll give you $1, right? So there was an old man who had this situation. And he had thought to pay the kids, right? But the problem with that is it's hard to keep up, right? So it's going to become costly to pay the kids every week. So instead, he decided he would, knowing a little bit about behaviorism and how to affect human behavior, he decided, I'm going to see if I can extinguish this activity, right? I'm going to pay the kids to bang on my trash cans, which is something they're already doing. So he externalized the reward for something that they already had an intrinsic reward for. So they started banging the trash cans, and he paid him $1. Eventually, he started scaling back how much he paid them to the point where it wasn't worth it to the kids to bang on it anymore because they weren't getting the reward. It wasn't as valuable as it used to be. So they told him that they were just going to stop banging on his trash cans. So in this case, this was somebody who understood human behavior and sort of how to use rewards and to extinguish certain behaviors. But yeah, external motivations definitely can backfire. If we were to try to always use external rewards to get people to do things, and if we can't maintain those after a while, they may stop doing those very things that we're trying to get them to do. So we do eventually, with good behaviors, want them to be intrinsic. So I would still contend, though, doing good is better than not doing good. So that's my take on it. So Andrew his kids are now coming in from the cold weather, it looks like. Thank you so much, and thank you for participating in this. I really appreciate it. It's been an interesting endeavor to come here and sit down inside, but I feel like we've been able to hear from so many more people by doing this online. So we've been able to take something that got turned upside down and turn it maybe upright, even better than it was to begin with. So for everybody that has been here, thank you so much. I'll stick around for another 5 to 10 minutes, answer questions, and just read answers as they're coming across. If you have any questions or suggestions, there's lots of great suggestions on here. So for anybody who's following the conversation, love the suggestions that are coming through. And if anybody's interested in collaborating on this and other ideas in computing, obviously, I'd love to collaborate and to hear from people. Um, I'm really excited to see what's going on. I came to the UK because of the great things that you're doing here. So I really appreciate um, all the work that you're doing, and I hope that you see the value in what you're doing, even though I know you're struggling through it and you're tripping over your feet, as some people have told me, as you've worked through some different and are trying to work through how to teach computing. But the rest of the world is watching, and we appreciate you tripping over your feet so that hopefully we don't have to. So I really appreciate that. And for those who are around, so getting into the personal side of Peter, those who don't know me, one of the things that I tend to do with my kids is I tend to talk in different accents every once in a while. So just for fun, I think I'm going to read things off in different accents right now. As I do that, I don't mean to be offensive. I actually have tried. When I hear an accent, I tend to slip into it if I can, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And I've loved to hear people talk. I'm fascinated by hearing people talk here in in the UK. So I'll go into my best Scottish as I can here, and hopefully it's not offensive to anybody, and hopefully it's Scottish, right? So, as Nari Leonard said, thank you, Peter, sharing my thoughts about computational thinking to the staff next Thursday. So hopefully my school will have a lot to share. I'll definitely do so. Some of the other comments I have in here. I apologize, by the way, to everybody who was trying to get in, who wasn't able to get in today. If you have comments, again, I'll answer them in the comment section. You're kind of seeing the crazy side of me now, a little bit different. And I hope everybody gets home safely if they're not already home. You need to be careful in this weather. It can be really dangerous again. That is. Nari says, this is what you sound like. Well, Nari, it's nice to meet you in that case. So there's different ways of talking about it. All right. And I notice very many different accents coming from England as well. Different northern, southern, and all across. Very interesting to talk to listen to people. I love listening to people. Judy, lovely. In fact, I was thinking the same thing about seminars. You said this might be a new way of doing seminars for you. I would love to. I was thinking about extending our community beyond our own geographical bounds, actually. We're trying to establish a community in Utah where teachers are popping up here and there teaching computing, but they're kind of on their own. The difficulty is getting people to come to a seminar like this. So sometimes we have the geographical constraints. My state is probably more like Scotland in that way than it is like England, where we can't always drive a long distance. There's the population is sort of concentrated along one mountain range, but the others who live in the different mountain ranges, they have difficulty getting out to the seminar. So maybe something online like this. We would love to hear from your experience here. If you could share that with us in Utah and share ideas on how to teach, it would be lovely. As Judy said, a bit Irish there. The problem is everything slides in one to the other. I don't really know how to keep it all separate. It's my first time being over in Europe, so it's it gets a little bit different. It does every time. We're very, very happy to have everybody be here. So hopefully everybody has a good day. And I think pretty soon we will have to be turning this off. Again, I hope that I have not offended anybody as I am talking this way. We're just entertaining myself at this point. Everybody who is there, I think it is about time. I'm going to sign off. You are to be having a good day. Very much. Mark, I appreciate you being here. Very inspiring. More Irish and Scottish. You are going to be having a good day. All right. We will continue this conversation online.